Hi, everyone. It's Rachel Gerber here of the Gathering Place. I'm the Denominational Minister for Christian Formation for Mennonite Church USA and editor of The Gathering Place, which is an interactive website for youth leaders in the Mennonite Church to learn, be, and connect. And every month we focus on a new theme, and everything that we do hinges upon that theme. And this month we were talking about race in the church, and racism. And I'm thrilled today to have Iris de Leon-Hartshung, who is our denominational minister or director of transformative peacemaking for Mennonite Church USA, and she wears a lot of hats and does an amazing job in what she does. So welcome, Iris, to the Gathering Place.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, hey, this month, a few weeks ago, there was a news article that came out, which was talking about specifically the Pacific Southwest Mennonite Conference and how they are figuring it out, as it is one of the most diverse conferences that we have in Mennonite Church, and how they're figuring out how to communicate with one another and having some troubles figuring all that out, and kind of realizing that there's a lot of different ways, diversity and communication styles and patterns, and how that all plays into being the people of God and the church that God wants us to be. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the diversity that you're seeing in our conferences these days?
Well, I think diversity has always been there in our conferences.
Yeah, right.
When we talk about just theological differences, we've always had those, but now we're adding more cultural differences as we get more and more immigrant groups. And maybe 20, 30 years ago, those groups would have been from Latin America, from Mexico, maybe a few people from Asia and Africa, but all those numbers are increasing. And so like Pacific Southwest has a lot of Indonesian churches, African churches, and then they have the dominant culture churches that have been there for a long time. Pacific Southeast would be another one that has Haitian, Dominican, Rufina, just a ton of different immigrant groups.
Yeah.
New York City would be another place. Chicago is another place. So increasingly, our churches are becoming more diverse. And we're finding out that the way that we've done things, the way that we're used to doing things, doesn't always communicate well with those that are coming from a different place. Mm-hmm. And I think with Pacific Southwest, even though some of those immigrant groups have been there for 20 or 30 years, they came in with a very different background of what even Anabaptism looks like. And I would say maybe a lot of them are more evangelical, more Pentecostal, not all of them, but a lot of them, which is very different than what we think of original white Mennonite churches in the Midwest, or really even in the farming communities in California. They would mimic a lot of the churches in the Midwest in that style. So even the church I go to, Portland Mennonite Church, is even though we have people say, well, you have a lot of young people. We have a lot of young people, but still it's also very traditional in a lot of ways. So when we have this diversity of especially different cultural groups come in, we have to figure out how we start communicating different. We have to think about where we have our meetings, where traditionally one group may have met, let's say they go to the mountains up in a retreat center, and that's where they have their meetings. Well, that might not be accessible to immigrant groups that could be costly to get there. They may not have the transportation to get there. I mean, there's a lot of things, or they may be bivocational. Therefore, they can't take 2 or 3 days off for a meeting. They might be able to take a half a day or whatever. So I think there's a lot of things that we don't think about when we start to plan meetings. Another thing about meetings is we talk about, well, they can join us by video. But, you start to find out that there's a lot of retreat centers that don't have internet.
Yeah. or really bad internet, right?
Or they have really bad internet, and then you get there planning to have them join, and you can't because either the internet is bad or there's no internet.
Right.
So we've never had to really think through all of that, and now we're having to think through that. Also, how we communicate change. So for Pacific Southwest, they had a huge, a huge mandate, and they were doing it in a way that they have never done it before. Which, you know, if it had been one group, they could have probably might have been okay. But when you have people from all over the world, that takes more time. That takes more. Email isn't as effective.
Yeah, because it starts with the relationship, right?
Right.
I mean, getting to know one another.
It's not that they don't have email. They do have email. But you begin to realize that email only works if you have had a long-term person-to-person relationship with them.
Yeah.
Then email can work after that. But when you sort of know them, but not that well, or whatever, or you don't go to their place, and that's the other piece is that we always ask these groups to come meet on
our turf.
And our
turf, right? Yeah.
You know, and we don't take the time to go to theirs. Like I get a lot of calls sometimes from different agencies saying, you know, we invite this group or that group, and I said, but have you ever gone to their church? Have you ever gone to their conference, or have you ever gone to their gathering to speak or to just even be with them? That's a very important thing. It's just being there with them. That's very important in building the relationship. We just think that we send an invitation, everyone should just come, but that doesn't work anymore. We have to find other ways of communicating with people. And so, I mean, one of them is just and you know, Mennonites are good at relationships. It's not that we're not good at relationships, but we're just having to figure out a different way of doing it. And it's going to take more time. It's going to take more face-to-face. And that's just the reality as new groups come in.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit about what, I don't know, are there better practices for getting, I don't know, to making those initial connections? You know, is it, how does one best sort of approach those? I don't know, because I wouldn't want it to be like, I want to get to know you trying to figure out this question here. Like an authentic, you know, reciprocal kind of, like how, what are some better practices?
Yeah, I think attending their events. I mean, you know, like we have Iglesia Menonita, or we have the African Association, we have the Native American, the African, Belizean, Caribbean group, and then we have the Indonesian, and we have the Asian ministry group. They all have different kinds of events. Some have yearly assemblies, some have just meetings, but most of them are always open to have people come. And so it's just going to their event, just being there, not with any agenda, but just being there to meet people, to get to know them. I think that's always a good start.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, can you talk a little bit about, I mean, obviously every group is going to communicate in a different way. Can you give some examples about differences in communication styles or patterns, or, I don't know, things to culturally identify?
I think, that's, I mean, one of the things we do on intercultural competency is, you know, what's the difference between stereotyping groups and generalizations?
Right.
So, you know, generalizations has to do with, you know, that 55 to 85% of that population, that's something they practice. I think one of the most difficult groups is probably, we all lump into Asian groups. For instance, Indonesians, I don't even know how many dialects they have, but they have lots of dialects, and one dialect doesn't necessarily understand another dialect.
Okay.
And so they would have very different cultures and different understandings, even though they would still be
Indonesian Mennonites, right?
Indonesian Mennonite, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. You know, and so for me, it's just you just have to get to know the group. I think like one of the things I try and pay attention, especially when we have meetings with different communication styles, is groups like a lot of the Asian groups. Native Americans would also be included in that. They're more. Some of them are more introverted. They're not going to be the first ones to speak. So usually I tell people when you have decisions to make, it's good to have one day that you discuss the decisions that you have to make, and then have an overnight and not vote or make a decision till the next day. That gives people that are more introverted or people that are Native American that tend to be more quiet, or some Asian groups that tend to be more quiet and not speak up, gives them a chance to think through, and then they feel better and they feel that they're actually contributing when they vote because they've had time to think about it.
Yeah.
So I think that, we have to think about those kind of things. I mean, I've always often heard introverts always say that. And now that we're getting other cultural groups that have a tendency to be more introverted, I think you really just have to pay attention to that. That not everyone, like, I'm the kind of person, I jump in conversation, let's make the decision. Let's go, let's make a decision and go. And I have to realize, no, not everyone does that. Yeah. Some people really need time to reflect. And so, that's one of them. I think another thing when I think about the different groups is when we give material, like to read or to make a decision. Sometimes I've gone to groups where everyone got it in English, and then the Spanish speakers might get it that day because they had to wait. They had to wait till it got translated. Well, then of course they're not on the same. It's not a level playing field because they haven't had time to really digest. And then someone said, well, they speak English, but if English wasn't their first language, they're still not going to get the detail of the information as they would if they had it in their own language to begin with. So I think, translation's a tricky thing. It takes time. I know it's more expensive, but if we're really going to want people to be on the same playing field and have equal say in something, they have to have the information like everyone else, and they have to have time to digest it like everyone else.
Yeah, that's a really good word. That's a really good word. Yeah, because we are a multicultural church, and so what does it mean to give access to power to everyone, right? And education and understanding information is a major component of that.
Yeah, I mean, information is power.
Absolutely. And you're not even Oprah. Absolutely. It is. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about dynamics and power that you see? I mean, so there's communication, styles, and you said, talked about like how folks might have a retreat up in the mountains. That's another issue of power. Like what other things should the dominant group be sensitive to or aware of that they might not even realize there's a power imbalance going on there?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think one of the things that I've seen this throughout the years, maybe in the last, for the last 20, 25 years, I've seen some of these dynamics around resources. And I'm talking about for our older churches. I mean, I know some of them are rural and they're losing members. But as far as resources, for a long time, they've been very steady, and they've had plenty of resources. When the newer groups started coming in, some of them came from countries like Africa, maybe in a country that they were in a war. And so the idea of resources is very different than what we might consider in the dominant culture, where we talk about saving money, having a retirement. We talk about all these things. When we have these groups that come in, they didn't know they were going to live the next day.
Right.
I mean, so the perspective of how they use their resources is very different, and then we judge them on it. Like, why don't they save their money? Why don't they do this? Why don't they do that with their money or their resources? But the reality is, for some of those groups, they didn't know if there was going to be a tomorrow. And the instability of the countries that they come from. All of that really plays into we have to make judgments about how we use our money, who has money, who doesn't. Sometimes I feel like sometimes it's not said, but it's not said in words, but just the way people react sometimes, that some people are resentful that we have all these churches that need to be supported, and that sometimes the dominant culture feels we're doing the supporting, and I even get that. I'm on the Mennonite World Conference Executive Committee. Right. And it's true that the majority of the money for Mennonite World Conference comes from North America and in Europe, because we are the ones have had the money, have had the resources. And so sometimes I hear people talk about that, that why don't the other groups give or whatever. And some of those groups are giving as their countries become more stable and their economy becomes more stable. But it's kind of weird to me that people don't think they just think that what it's like here in the U.S., it's like that all over the world.
Right.
And it's not. It's not.
Yeah.
So I think power, and when we talk about resources, that's where a lot of power is.
Right.
And sometimes people with resources feel more entitled to have a bigger say in decisions than those that don't. And I think we have to be very, very careful, because I think that happens a lot without us even realizing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, how can I wield my money power, and give it or take it based on, what I want, the income, the end goal that I want, but that's not right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now I've heard you talk about the power cube before. I'm not super familiar with that. Is that something you can explain about in the
I can. I can kind of tell you the framework of the power cube.
Yeah.
What I like about this power cube, and actually you can go to powercube.net.
Okay.
And if you go there, you can get the full handbook free.
Okay.
In addition to, they have videos of how they do case studies using the power cube.
Okay.
So the power cube is three-dimensional. I have only been able to use two-dimensional. I haven't had time to really work with groups for three-dimensional, but we do two-dimensional. And so one is the kinds of power, and then the other one is spaces. Okay. So like spaces is a space that you're invited to, a space that you're not invited to, and then a space that you claim yourself. Okay. And then they talk about visible power, hidden power, and invisible power. Okay. So those are the kinds of different powers. So, like, for instance, when we talk about sometimes groups that have not been included, oftentimes they will claim their own space. And I think, like, Hope for the Future is that. People of color got together that were leaders and say, hey, we need our own space to talk about our agenda. We invite white people, but it's about our agenda to talk about if they want to join us. So that's claim space. When we go to board meetings, that's invited space. Okay. We're invited, but we're not in charge of the agenda, whatever. If you go to a board meeting and they say, we're having closed session or executive session. That's uninvited space.
Right. Thank you. I will. Yeah. I'll give that.
Yeah. And of course, there's more cynical ways that can play out, like secret meetings or, those kind of things that, because since this power cube is used all over the world, there are governments that do have these secret meetings and those kind of things. So that's they would use that with a power cube. Mm-hmm. But, we talk about, and I'm trying to think in my mind how it all plays out. The visible power is everyone knows how decisions are made, who makes a decision, who's included, who's not included in that decision. Doesn't mean visible power doesn't mean that everyone's included in the decision making. It's just that it's visible. Everyone knows how it's
working. Yeah.
It's working. It's not about that. Invisible power is power that people inside know how it works. Mm. So if you're inside, you know how it works.
Yeah.
But other people may not quite know how that works.
Yeah.
But the most insidious is hidden. When you intentionally leave groups out and intentionally make decisions, knowing that it's going to impact groups, but they're not allowed to be included in decision making, nor do they even maybe know how those decisions are being made. Yeah. That's a more intentional way of hiding power.
Gotcha.
So when we use a power cube, we actually tape a cube on the floor. Mm-hmm. So they're like 12 by 12 inch squares. Mm-hmm. And then we have a case study, and we make people stand as we read the story. They play a character in the case study, and they move around in the cube according to how the power is used.
Okay.
And I think it's important because I think for Mennonites, everything's in our head. Mm-hmm. And I think it's good to have this body experience about how we use power.
Yeah.
And one of the things we learned is white people have more ability to almost utilize all of the squares, where people with less power are limited in the squares that they use in the power cube.
Yeah.
But I really like the power cube because I just think it just gives a physical.
Yeah, it's tangible. It's tangible. Yeah. I really like that. I think though, however, with Mennonites, I think we're averse to power, right?
Oh yeah.
We want everyone to, quote unquote, be peaceful and in harmony, but really we're not really feeling like that underneath the surface. We have very specific ways that we want people to function. And
I think that was one of the questions. If you read the news release of the executive board meeting, Racial Ethnic Council, that was one of the questions they asked them. How do you use power? And it was very hard to answer because as Mennonites, we don't want to, first of all, we want to say our theology is around servanthood. So how can a servant have power?
Right.
See, this is kind of, I like our theology, but I think that there is a pitfall in it because we're not as open to name how we use power, and we always see it as only negative instead of using power for good.
Yeah.
And so I think you got to find a balance of yes, sometimes power is negative, but there are a lot of times power is good,
right?
And you're prone to abuse power if you don't recognize it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It can be damaging if you're not able to name the power that you do hold. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's very fascinating. Well, what do you hope for as the Mennonite Church continues to evolve into this more of a multi-ethnic, multicultural a place to be? What do you really hope for and long for in in leadership and just the culture of the church. Yeah. What are your dreams?
Well, I think, we've had moments. I think women doing theology has been one place. Hope for the Future has been another, where we've had these spaces to honestly speak with each other around power, even when we disagree. But we're able to do it in a way that I think is healthy. And I think that if we could move the whole church to begin to do that, to not be afraid to talk about power, not to be afraid, like the Pacific Southwest, when this happened, I think the immediate thing has been, the immediate thing has been, I don't know, feel ashamed or don't want people to know we made a mistake. But I think that if we can have the courage to say, hey, here's some mistakes we made, this is how we're going to work at it, and to think of more of a learning community, that we're learning together. We're all going to make mistakes. And Pacific Northwest, they made some mistakes, but they recognize what those were. They're going to work on those. And it also gives the broader church, by allowing to have their story told, to hear that and to be aware of that, so that when they're, trying to make decisions around big changes that's going to impact people of color or immigrant churches, that they keep these things in mind. So I think the way we frame things more as a learning together, not of shaming people, not of, you're wrong, we're right, but we're learning together as church. And to have some honest conversations and say it's okay that we don't agree, but let's respectfully listen to each other.
Yeah. And also I think it's probably important to name too that, speaking as a white woman, I want to be culturally sensitive. I want to be hospitable and welcoming, and probably I inadvertently, totally screw up, not meaning to, you know what I mean? And also I think it's, that shouldn't stop me from continuing to try,
right,
because I'm afraid of putting my foot in my mouth or whatever. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think it's.
Yeah. And that's one of the things we talk about when we do the intercultural competency training, that if you don't try, if you don't try and do things differently, you're not going to learn. Right. And part of learning is we make mistakes. And so I think that, if it's this fear of always needing to be right or not making a mistake, I think that can just really prevent us from learning, even when we make a mistake.
Yeah. Oh, that's neat. Well, can you say a little bit about this intercultural competency and how, if there's pastors or other faith leaders that want to get more training to be more sensitive, how do they do that?
Yeah. Well, we actually on our website have intercultural competency. It's called the IDI on the Mennonite Church USA website. And we now actually have 18 people trained to do the training.
Awesome.
So they're throughout the whole U.S.
Yeah.
So, if you're really interested, it'd be good, to get your conference, maybe conference leaders want to take it, or maybe you want to get a group of youth leaders to do it. But you would just go to our website and contact one of the facilitators. What I like about the IDI is that you can use it as a base of where you're at. Okay. And then it's clear about what steps and what skills do you need to work on to move toward being more culturally competent. Yeah. And also talks about, for Mennonites, not just Mennonites, but since I just work mainly with Mennonites, it's been helpful to see where we are as a group, because power and privilege is difficult to talk about unless you're at a certain point of interculturally competence. And I think Mennonites are now beginning to enter to that point of now to have these conversations in a way that they can better understand power and see it for themselves and privilege. So that part is exciting, but we're just at the beginning of that, I think, as a church.
Would the IDI be something that youth pastors could also bring someone into their youth group or a cluster of youth groups?
I think they suggest like older youth, probably
Okay.
not younger youth.
Okay.
I would say maybe juniors and seniors,
Uh-huh.
only because cognitively, you might not be developed enough to
see things from the other perspective. Yeah.
So I think that's what they say.
Okay, that's helpful. That's helpful. Well, is there anything else, you final word you want to say, Iris, to the Gathering Place community about this topic or your work or anything else?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I'm just saying, I just really hope that everyone can just see this as being church together, of learning together, and be okay with making mistakes and just keep moving forward.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for all you do and for what you do and how you invite us into greater awareness of, the church that God's calling us to be. So I really appreciate your work. And thanks so much for talking to the Gathering Place today.
All right. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Bye.